Hi, everyone. I think we'll get started now. My name is Erica Rauscher, and I'm the Executive Director of the THANK Foundation, which is the Thyroid Head and Neck Cancer Foundation. On behalf of my planning partners from the Head and Neck Cancer Alliance, SPUNK, and the National Foundation of Swallowing Disorders, I want to thank all of you for being here today for our community webinar on xerostomia.
Last one.
Can everybody mute who's joined the meeting, please? Thank you.
Oh.
In this meeting, you'll learn more about the externally led, patient-focused drug development process and meeting which we have scheduled for Thursday, August 19th. As an overview, the PFDD is an exciting initiative designed to inform FDA about the patient perspective of living with xerostomia. We're grateful for your participation and willingness to make your voice heard. The virtual format of this program will allow us to hear from people all over the world. We want to hear directly from you, patients and caregivers, regardless of where you are in your journey of living with xerostomia. We want to hear your perspective, including symptoms, limitations on quality of life, and treatments you have tried. The patient perspective is critical to help FDA understand the context in which decisions are made regarding new therapies. Next slide, please. We're grateful to Mira GTX for their financial support of the meeting. And finally, we have other nonprofit partner organizations whom I would like to recognize, namely the American Board of Swallowing and Swallowing Disorders, Side Effect Support, the Sjogren's Foundation, Dysphagia Research Society, Curaden, Next slide, please. Before I hand over the microphone to our hosts, Larry Bauer and James Valentine, I have a few housekeeping points to make. The webinar will last approximately 1 hour. All participants will be muted, but we do encourage you to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to address all comments and questions before the end of the webinar. Finally, the webinar is being recorded and will be available to view later for anyone who couldn't make it or who'd like to see it again. Thank you again for joining us, and I will now pass the meeting along to James.
Can you hear me now? It's like the classic cell phone commercial. Just want to make sure that you're able to hear me.
Yes, we can, James.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So this is James Valentine, and you just heard the voice of my colleague, Larry Bauer, from a Washington, D.C.-based firm, Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. But more importantly, we're serving as partners with the organizations you saw noted before in bringing together and helping plan this very important externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. Both Larry and I were formerly officials at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration who were engaged and part of our job was bringing in the patient voice to regulatory decision-making through various roles within the agency. So for today, our hope and goal is to orient you a bit to this externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, and really importantly, the role that the patient voice plays, including through these meetings in the drug development process, and in hopes of helping you feel more comfortable in participating in this upcoming meeting, knowing why it's important and where exactly your voices will fit in. So if you can go to the next slide. So just to start with a little bit about this meeting before we dive into some more educational topics, this meeting is really important. It's an important opportunity to educate the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, but also other important stakeholders like those that are developing new drugs and other medical products for xerostomia, to make sure they really understand what it's like to live with xerostomia from the patient and caregiver perspective, how the condition has impacted your lives, how you're currently managing your xerostomia, how well that's working, etc. And really what your treatment goals are. What would meaningful treatments look like for you as defined as by you, the individual living with xerostomia. Next slide. And so to help educate, it's important that you participate because we want to hear from as many voices as possible during this process. It's a really great opportunity to actually have your voices heard directly. As you'll hear later, FDA will be participating in this meeting where they'll be listening to all of you. And this is important because FDA has the responsibility to approve any and all treatments for xerostomia, at least in the United States. And in order for them to make better decisions, they need to know what is important to you. And so having this knowledge about what it is, your experiences, your preferences for treatments, that will actually impact their decision-making and will help lead to better for treatments and maybe even potentially faster approvals for treatments. Next slide. So you might be wondering why now. FDA's been at this for a long time. They've existed for many decades. Well, in part, it's because the patient's voice has historically been absent from the drug development process. It wasn't really until a drug was approved by the FDA, where sometimes it would treat symptoms that maybe aren't as important to patients, or when a clinical trial was failing and a drug company or FDA needed input to help understand what was going on. Are we measuring the wrong things? Why are patients dropping out? Different issues like that they would then engage with patients. But there's been a real culture shift really in the last decade where the voice of patients is really at the center now of decision-making, and decision-making that happens very early on in the process, as well as throughout the whole process, which I'll be talking to you about in just a few moments. And really stakeholder engagement, I can say as being a former FDA official, that has really become a priority for the agency. And that actually led the agency, when both Larry and I were there, to initiate the patient-focused drug development program. This was something that was actually the idea of FDA officials, including the current acting commissioner, Dr. Janet Woodcock. And the idea was to learn more about the disease impact on patients' lives, both from patients and their caregivers, and not rely solely on the medical literature, on expert doctors, but there's so much more value that can be brought in understanding of a condition than can be understood just from those perspectives alone. Next slide. So with some of that kind of opening background, we're going to go into this in this webinar. Larry and I are going to tag team and share some information with you that we view as very important to your participation in the meeting. If you've already decided to attend, we hope this will kind of just help prepare you a little bit better. If you're still thinking about, is this something that's right for me to participate in? Hopefully you'll see that, each and every one of you are experts in your condition and the lived experience and have something to contribute. And so we hope that you will participate. So we're going to start with a background on FDA and drug development. I'm going to provide that overview. Some of that might be a refresher for some of you. But for others, we want to make sure we're all talking the same language. After that, Larry's going to transition us and talk to you about where the patient voice fits into that drug development process, including how the patient-focused drug development meeting is kind of specifically designed to do that. And then we'll get into some more of the kind of practical information that you need to understand the logistics, form and format of the meeting and how you all would be participating. Next slide. So let's go ahead and get into it. And I'm going to now talk to us a bit about background on FDA and drug development. If we can go to the next slide. This process really starts with drug discovery. So this is before we actually know what the drug is going to be, where thousands of compounds might actually be potential candidates for drug development as a potential medical treatment. It's only after this early testing where a small number of compounds that look promising based off of their key attributes and many tests that might then be carried forward and studied in a way to where we can start to evaluate their safety and efficacy. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that the first type of testing that we would do once we do identify those compounds is called preclinical development. And that term means exactly what it sounds like, preclinical. So this is pre-studies in humans or in patients. So this is testing that might be kind of, think of it as like Petri dish testing or testing in animals. And so this is all done before we ever do any testing in humans. This is a requirement that the FDA has to help us make sure that a product is reasonably safe for initial use in humans, and that it would be, there's sufficient evidence that it will be effective actually in doing what we think it will in terms of helping treat the disease. Of course, not all, animal or other preclinical studies will translate into the same safety and efficacy in patients. That's why we still need to do clinical trials. But this then sets up drug developers to move in what's called an investigational new drug application to the FDA that provides to them this information and allows then testing in the clinic with humans. So if we go to the next slide, so in that IND, that's an investigational new drug application. So in that submission, that is going to include all that information from those animal studies. Pharmacology is kind of the general term we use for evaluating whether the drug is working in the animal studies, and toxicology is the term that we use for the studies that are evaluating the safety in those animal studies. So in addition to those preclinical studies, a sponsor or a drug developer will then also submit information about how they manufacture the drug to show that they can produce it in a quality manner, as well as provide their proposals for how they're going to study this drug in the clinic. And this might be, as you'll hear about just now, it could be in healthy volunteers, or it could be in individuals living with the particular condition. But either way, that is proposed to FDA, and FDA then reviews that and determines whether there's sufficient information on the potential for drug benefit, drug safety, and drug quality to allow that clinical trial to proceed. And they may even have comments on the clinical trial itself to ensure that it is going to help answer the important clinical questions that we have. So the first set of clinical testing that we do is called phase 1 clinical trials. And so the primary goals here is to start evaluating the drug's safety. So these studies are done in smaller numbers of people. Sometimes this is in very prevalent conditions. This might be 100 healthy volunteers. This could be down to just, a couple tens of patients in a more rare condition. And so here we're looking to see whether the product can be safely used, before we then move it into larger phase 2 or phase 3 studies. By administering the drug, we're going to see what the most common side effects are. Of course, there can be rare side effects, but we won't know what those are until, the drug is tested in many, many more people. But at least we can understand, are those common side effects, pretty tolerable, or are they really serious? And that might be important to know to decide whether we should be moving into phase 2. We also see how the drug is actually metabolized and excreted. So, is it getting in a sufficient amounts depending on how it's administered to the right parts of the body? Is it staying in the body long enough to have an effect? Some of those early questions. Once we answer some of those questions, if we go to the next slide, you'll see that we move into what are called phase 2 clinical trials. And so this is where we now start to begin to emphasize the drug's effectiveness, or whether the drug actually has the treatment effect that we are testing it for. So in phase 2 studies, researchers administer the drug to, this is actually in patients with the disease or condition for which the drug is being developed. And in traditional, drug development, this can be a few hundred patients at this point in time. These studies still, even with that many patients, aren't large enough to definitively show whether the drug is beneficial, but we can start to get what's called proof of concept information about the drug's benefit. It's in these phase 2 studies. We also, and this is consistent throughout drug development, we're always looking to collect additional safety data. And then we're looking to, based off of, which subgroups, whether maybe that's younger or older patients, patients with more severe or more mild symptoms, whatever that might be. We use this information from phase 2 to design our phase 3 trials. And so, we want to make sure that the drug ultimately is going to have an effect on how a patient feels, how a patient functions, or how a patient survives. And that's ultimately going to be what FDA can base an approval off of, more so those types of outcomes rather than biomarkers or lab values that might be able to be assessed. So once we complete that phase 2 testing, we move into phase 3 on the next slide. And so here, this is kind of our traditional large-scale randomized, often placebo-controlled trials. This, it can be in studies as large as, hundreds to thousands of volunteers of people living with the disease or condition. In rare diseases, that is often much, much less in terms of the size. These are longer studies. Many, depending on the condition, these studies can go out to a year. Sometimes, much less frequency, but they sometimes can even be longer than a year. And here we're trying to really understand the drug benefit. Of course, still evaluating safety. With these studies being much larger, we can detect some of the more rare risks, rare side effects that might happen. But these are truly designed to see whether the treatment has a meaningful drug effect compared to the placebo response. And then if that is a meaningful effect, and it's one that's reliable. So you might have heard of p-values before. A lot of the times our target is to get a statistical p-value of less than 0.05. That gives us confidence that that treatment benefit isn't due to chance, but is truly due to the intervention, the drug that's being tested. Sometimes we need more than one phase 3 study. Other times we might be able to have a drug be approved based off of a single phase 3 study. But speaking of approval, if we go to the next slide, the process to get to an approval is through a marketing application. This is for a drug called a new drug application. For a biological product, this could be an enzyme, an antibody, a cell therapy, or a gene therapy. Those are types of biologics. It's very similar, almost exactly the same application. It's called a biologics license application. So for drugs, you have NDAs. For biologics, you have BLAs. A drug developer will put together, their information and first meet. Usually they'll first meet with FDA in what's called a pre-NDA or a pre-BLA meeting. In this meeting, they're going to highlight the pivotal, often that's going to be their phase 3 clinical trials. They're going to discuss the analyses that they that they've run and those that they would propose to conduct to submit in their marketing application. And it's an opportunity before they actually submit that NDA or BLA to get some feedback from FDA, see if there's information that's missing or some analyses that they haven't yet done that FDA would want to see prior to submitting their application. That way they make sure FDA has everything that they need to conduct their review. So that NDA is essentially the summary of everything that's been done, all of that preclinical or animal data, all of the human data from clinical trials, all of the manufacturing data and information that's been generated throughout the entire process is all put together into that single marketing application. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that once that NDA or BLA is submitted by a drug company, FDA first reviews it to see if it's complete. And if so, they file the NDA or BLA, and that is what then allows them to start their review. So they actually do a review just on completeness first. And if they don't see that the application is complete or has the type of information that would allow them to make an approval decision, they will refuse to file the product application. But if they start their review, if they say, okay, we've got the information we need, let's file this application, they're going to then look to see whether the effectiveness of the drug has been demonstrated for the specific use that it's been proposed. So a drug company will call out specifically, is there a specific disease or condition? Is there a specific even group within people with a particular disease or condition that they're targeting? Or maybe they're only targeting one aspect of a disease or condition. And so FDA is looking to see if the drug is effective for the specific use that it's being asked for. They'll also look at the safety information to determine whether there's adequate safety. Ultimately, this is a relative thing. This is, we're looking to see if the benefits outweigh the risks. And so, what amount of risk you can tolerate for a drug is going to depend on how much benefit, what type of benefit the drug is providing. We all know, for example, that with like chemotherapy treatments for cancer, where that we tolerate a high level of toxicity in exchange for potential benefits of potential life-saving benefits. That's something that patients can weigh in on and help FDA understand. But that just helped put into perspective that if you had a different condition, let's just say headaches, you wouldn't accept the toxicity that comes with a chemotherapy, to treat, a common headache. So it's all relative. Again, manufacturing is part of this. We want to make sure that products are being made in a way that's high quality. That it doesn't have harmful impurities. You make sure that patients are going to get the components that they're supposed to be getting in that drug product. As part of FDA's review, you may have read in the news about advisory committees. These are committees that FDA doesn't have to, but if they want to, they can seek external expert input. It is non-binding input, so FDA still is the ultimate decider, but it can be useful input to help them weigh important issues related to an application. So if all of that is successful, FDA will approve a drug or license a biologic. If not, they will issue what's called a complete response letter that lays out the deficiencies that they found and provides usually a path to a resubmission. It may involve conducting another clinical trial, doing some other non-clinical test, resolve some manufacturing issue, or some combination of those things. And then that would allow them to reevaluate the total package. We go to the next slide. I just want to call out that FDA's job doesn't end once a drug is approved. They do monitor post-market safety. Clinical trials by definition are very limited in terms of the number of people that are actually using the drug. And so when the drug gets approved and goes out onto the market, it's going to be used by many, many more people. And because of that, there might be real world situations that weren't studied in trials, or just because it's going to many more people, we might discover more rare side effects. And so FDA is constantly evaluating that information that comes into them or that they can see through some of their surveillance systems, and continuously evaluate whether the benefits of the drug continue to outweigh these new risks that might emerge. So if we go to the next slide, I want to, now that we've given a quick and high-level overview of the drug development process, kind of talk to you a bit about what is FDA's role, because you're going to be in this PFDD meeting talking to FDA, and they're listening to help inform their regulatory decisions. So to help you focus on what's important to talk to them about, it's important to know what exactly they do as part of that drug development process, as well as what they don't do or what they don't focus on. So if we go to the next slide, in terms of that drug development process and those clinical trials that I just talked about, it's important to know that FDA does not develop drugs. It's researchers, often at academic institutions, pharmaceutical or biotech companies, even not-for-profit organizations are conducting research as well as developing drugs. So it's not only is FDA not developing the drugs, they're not even testing the drugs in trials. They rely on the information from trials that's provided to them by companies. And of course, they audit that data. but FDA is not actually running trials. They're not on site during clinical trials. And, so it's the researchers and developers that are doing those trials and bringing that information before FDA to review when they're seeking approval. If you go to the next slide, another topic that I want to talk about in terms of what FDA does and doesn't do relates to both the practice of medicine and drug costs. So it's important to know that FDA regulates those that are developing and researching drugs. They don't actually have authority over the practice of medicine. So those that are your doctors, your nurse practitioners, other prescribers that have the ability to prescribe you as a patient a drug, that is considered the practice of medicine. And so FDA doesn't have that jurisdiction over that. And so your doctors are free to prescribe you a drug for a use that it's not approved for from the FDA. And this is often known as off-label use. So it's important to know that FDA does not have authority over the practice of medicine and doesn't have the ability to regulate off-label use by practitioners. It's also important to know that FDA does not regulate the price of medicine or whether your insurance will cover a medicine. In fact, FDA, that information is not provided to FDA during drug review. By law, it can't, even if it did have that information, it can't rely on that to just, make an approval decision. So when we're talking to FDA, talking about drug prices or insurance coverage, it's just not something that's within their mandate. They're focused on those drug benefits, those drug risks, and making sure that the benefits outweigh the risks. And so we want to make sure FDA is focused on those issues, and we're focusing on informing those decisions. And then one more slide I have on what it is that FDA does. I talked a bit about what FDA doesn't do. Just because FDA isn't running trials doesn't mean that they don't play a big role in helping facilitate drug development. Part of FDA's mission is not only to protect the public health, but also to promote the public health. And so what that means is FDA reviewers, they've reviewed thousands and thousands of different drug trial protocols. They've reviewed thousands and thousands of different data sets from completed drug trials, both those that have been successful as well as those that have not been. And so they have a lot of insight into what works and what doesn't work. And so throughout that drug development process, they have ways for those researchers and drug developers to come in and meet with them, get technical help and guidance from the agency. This helps, FDA wants to help companies design their trials and studies. And so this is really an iterative process. FDA doesn't just come in at the end when all of the studies are done. They're actually meeting with companies, throughout as each of those different phases of drug development are completed and weighing in then on what the next phase of drug development will look like. So if you go to the next slide, I know I covered a lot of information quickly. If you want to get more information on how FDA regulates medical products and just generally about FDA's framework for patient engagement, I would encourage you to visit this webpage, fda.gov/for-patients. There's a lot of valuable information there. So now that we've covered kind of a bit of a FDA and drug development 101, I'll call it, we now want to talk about the role of the patient voice and specifically these patient-focused drug development meetings. So to walk us through that, I'm going to hand this off to Larry Bauer.
Thank you so much, James. That was a great foundational overview of drug development, and it's excellent background for this meeting to help understand about the FDA and about drug review in general. So in this section, I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of this patient-focused drug development meeting. So can I have the next slide, please? So the purpose of this meeting, what is it? So the Food and Drug Administration wanted a more systematic way to gather the patient perspective about conditions and available treatment options. As James was saying, this often happened at the end of drug development, but they realized it was so important to have it at the beginning of the process, not the end. And the reason is that this information, hearing from patients and caregivers, it really helps inform the FDA's understanding of the benefit risk assessment when they're trying to make a decision whether or not to approve a new drug. And so this patient input, it helps the FDA when they are both, working with the company that's developing a drug, as well as when they're reviewing one of those market applications that James had mentioned, either an NDA or BLA, and trying to go through all the data. They really want to hear the patient perspective. Next slide, please. So as part of every FDA review, there's a formal step that's called evaluating the benefit and the risk of the new drug. So how does this help? How can it possibly help a condition? And what are the possible risks or side effects? And two of the steps, these are the 5 steps: analyzing the condition, analyzing what the current treatment options are, and then looking at the benefits of the drug, the risks, and how you could manage risk. Well, those last 3 things, those are what the drug company, they provide that information about. That's all their data from their clinical studies they did. But the first 2 things, the analysis of the condition and the current treatment options, this is where we could hear from patients and caregivers to learn about what is it like. For instance, for xerostomia, if a new product was being developed, what's the current status of xerostomia? How is it affecting people? What are the major symptoms that people have? And then what are the current treatment options that are available, and how well are those working? So, are they generally working well, or is there still a great unmet medical need because people are having symptoms that are untreated? Next. So for our xerostomia Voice of the Patient meeting, it's going to be a framework for discussing questions. These questions came from the FDA's original benefit risk framework, and they represent important considerations in their decision-making, as I had just mentioned. So we reviewed this and other disease area questions, and we tailored our agenda and panel questions to communicate the most important information related to xerostomia. So this meeting that we're going to have is targeted exclusively on xerostomia. And we just want to say one more time how much the FDA really emphasizes that active patient involvement and participation is the key to the success of these meetings. And it's very heartening for us to see that there was, I think at the highest count, there were 84 people that had tuned in today. That's a wonderful commitment from the xerostomia community. And we were really glad to see that. Next slide, please. So at the end of the meeting, after we've had this day of listening to patients and hearing what they have to say, we have a medical writer that's going to be taking notes, and we will record the meeting, and then we will write a report called the Voice of the Patient Report. This is a summary of the caregiver and audience testimony of polling data that we'll do during the meeting, and any submitted written comments. This document, the Voice of the Patient, it's a key communication to FDA review staff, as well as regulated industry, about what patients and caregivers most want to see in treatment. And this information, FDA says that they want this information because it informs them about ways to develop meaningful new treatments for xerostomia. And this Voice of the Patient report will be available for anyone. It will be on the public websites from your advocacy organizations, and the FDA will have it on their website as well. Next slide. So now a little bit about your actual participation in the meeting. As I said earlier, this meeting can't happen without your participation. Next slide. So this is a little bit about the meeting logistics. The meeting is for xerostomia patients as well as their caregivers or family members. It's for FDA staff, for people from the pharma and biotech companies. Those are the folks that are developing new treatments, as well as anyone else interested in learning about xerostomia. If you have a friend or a cousin that doesn't really understand what xerostomia is or how it affects you, they are free to join this meeting. It'll take place virtually on August 19th. From 10 in the morning we'll start, and it will go till 3:30 in the afternoon. Like I said, it's virtual, so people can tune in even from other countries. and it will be an interactive live stream. And there will be information, registration information that will have all the links as far as how to join the meeting. Next slide. So this is just a brief overview of what the day will look like. So at the beginning of the meeting, we'll have a welcome and introductory comments from the meeting co-moderator, as well as someone from the FDA will come and speak. We'll have a clinical expert who's going to give a background, a clinical background on xerostomia, and talk maybe a little bit about clinical trials that are going on. And then after we've heard from this clinical expert, the rest of the day will be devoted to hearing from you all. So it will be broken into two topics. The first topic is how xerostomia symptoms affect your life. So what are the symptoms you have and how do those affect you? And the second topic, and more in the afternoon, will be how do you manage symptoms, both current and then about current and future approaches to treatment. So what have you tried? What are you currently using? And the topics will include pre-recorded patient panels and will include polling questions and a moderated discussion with the audience. And after we have this moderated discussion, we will have a few closing comments and end the day. Next slide. So during the meeting, like we said, there'll be panelists that have pre-recorded statements. There'll be 5 people that talk about the symptoms and 5 people that talk about treatments. Each of those people will have a 5-minute pre-recorded statement, but then it's going to be opened up to all of you to call in, to write comments. And these are some of the discussion topics we'd like you to start thinking about. So for the first panel, topic 1, living with xerostomia, we're going to ask things like, of all the symptoms of xerostomia, which 1 to 3 symptoms have the most significant impact on your life? How does xerostomia affect you on your best and on your worst days? Describe your best days and your worst days. And then finally, are there specific activities that are important to you that you cannot do at all or as fully as you would like because of xerostomia? In other words, how has xerostomia impacted your job, your social life, family, all those kinds of things? Next slide. And then continuing on this topic, we're going to ask if your symptoms have changed over time. How has your ability to cope with the symptoms changed over time? So we're not just interested in the physical aspects of xerostomia, but also how has this affected you psychologically and emotionally? And what are maybe some of the things you fear most as you get older? What worries you about your condition and what frustrates you the most about your condition? Next slide. Then in the afternoon, we're going to shift to topic 2, which is about current challenges to treating xerostomia. Some of the topics that will be in this half of the meeting are, what are you currently doing to manage your xerostomia symptoms? So what kind of treatments are you using? This can be things that are, actually FDA approved medications, as well as things, I've been in other meetings where people have brought up acupuncture, dietary changes, exercise, it's not just medical treatments, but whatever you're using to try to help treat xerostomia. Then we want to know, how well do these treatments treat the most significant symptoms of your xerostomia? So are they effective? Do they partially treat the symptoms? Those kinds of things. And then the next question is, what are the most significant downsides to your current treatments and how do they affect your daily life? So what are the drawbacks to those treatments that you're currently using? And then we wanted to ask you as well, short of a complete cure, so if we're not developing a drug that will cure xerostomia, but what specific things would you look for in an ideal treatment for xerostomia? Next. Okay, so what will the discussion format look like? As I mentioned, there will be a panel of patients for each panel. They will be pre-recorded, so we'll see videos of their recording. And the purpose of the panel is to set the foundation for the broader audience discussion that will follow. The panelists are selected to reflect a range of experiences with the condition, and these people have worked really hard to come up with a 5-minute statement to describe their condition. And then after the panelists, the patients in the audience and online will have a chance to answer polling questions. The polling questions will take place on your telephone. There will be a URL that on the day of the meeting that tells you how to log in, and you will answer questions in real time. These are a starting off point for the discussion. And like I said, you can use cell phones, tablets, or laptops to answer. And it's both for patients as well as caregivers can answer these questions. Once we have some of that polling information, then we're going to move to an open discussion with patients in the audience. And the purpose of this is to build on the experience shared by the panel. And the moderator, who's James, who you just heard earlier, James will ask you questions and invite you to submit responses both in writing, or preferably we would like you to call in and actually have a discussion with James about what your symptoms are. Next. So a couple tips for effective participation. We'd like you to remember what FDA's role and the purpose of the meeting is. So, you know, James went over this very thoroughly about that we are going to be there to help and, you know, to teach, to educate the FDA and to give insights. You know, people living with xerostomia are the only ones who really understand what it is like to live with it. Nobody else, you know, the doctor treating you, he doesn't really understand. Your family doesn't really understand. So we want to, you know, learn from all of you. Another thing you can do is to review these discussion questions in advance. They will be available on the website before the meeting. And if you have something important to share, relate it to the most appropriate topic or panel question and call in. So you'll be able to follow the meeting and what the topic is. And then if something is interesting to you or you think that you have something to contribute, then call in at that time. And it's okay to reiterate a feeling or experience that somebody else already mentioned, even if it's similar to your own, but give it a personal or unique perspective from what it was like for you, you know. And try to keep your comments concise and focused. There's many voices to be heard about this emotional topic, and we want to hear from as many people as possible. And one thing to remember, if we don't get to your call, you can always send in additional comments after the meeting, and these will be included in the Voice of the Patient report. Next slide. So you'll participate in the meeting by webcast. The polling questions will be by your cell phone, and then you can call in with comments or written submissions. Your responses will be kept confidential. To register for the meeting, I think they put the link in the chat box here, so you can register anytime prior to August 19th. And comments with answers to the questions may be submitted for up to 30 days after the meeting. So even once the meeting's done, we're going to keep the line open to hear for, you know, for written comments for 30 days. And those comments, even up to the 30 days after the meeting, will be in the Voice of the Patient report. Next slide. So part of the reason we had this webinar today was to try and get you to be excited that this is a wonderful way for you to contribute, not just for your own life, but for all people that have xerostomia. It's your opportunity to be part of the process. You can have a meaningful impact on clinical trial designs, as well as drug development and drug review. Your collective voices, they must be heard from now on at the beginning of the process to help companies design better clinical trials that meet your needs and to help the FDA assess the risks and benefits with a full understanding of what the impact of xerostomia is on your lives and fully the patient perspective. So please help make a difference. Next slide. So we've left about the last, 12, 15 minutes for questions and answers. And I just wanted to clarify something too. I think we had the date for August 19th. I think it might have said 2020. It's not, it's 2021. So I just want to make sure that that's clear to everybody. It's this August. So we'd like to open it up for questions now. Gabby, have you gone through questions? Is there?
Yeah, actually, Jesse, this is Jesse
Or
here.
sorry, Jesse.
A few of the questions have been coming through. The first one we had was, what are current drugs being used for treatment of xerostomia? If maybe one of our panelists can discuss that, maybe Elizabeth Lipton Daly.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes. Mhm.
Fantastic. So one more time, if you can ask the question to me, and I'm happy to help answer that.
So yeah, the question, Elizabeth, is what current drugs are being used for treatment of xerostomia?
Yeah, there's not a ton of great options, but there's some home remedies that people can try and some over-the-counter options. One of the best things that people can do if they have xerostomia is to make sure they're maintaining really good oral hygiene. So brushing your teeth twice a day, using mouthwashes. There's certain mouthwashes that you can use that are specific for people with xerostomia. I'm happy to provide a list afterwards if that's helpful for people. But people with xerostomia often have tooth decay, cavities, because it's more common with people with dry mouth. So making sure that you're maintaining good oral hygiene is important. You can also do some things to try to promote saliva production. And saliva production helps protect your mouth and your teeth from that decay and the disease. So some things that you can try at home to kind of stimulate that saliva production is sucking or chewing on ice cubes or ice pops like popsicles if you can. They make sugarless gum. If it contains xylitol, that's something that you could try. Having plenty of water around. So sipping on water throughout the day if you're able to. I certainly recognize that there's many in our community that are unable to safely swallow water. So that's another consideration to keep in mind too for this population. There are some over-the-counter products that help with artificial saliva production. Happy to provide some information on that as well, in addition to toothpaste, some of the mouthwashes that I mentioned that you can try, different lip balms as well.
Yeah.
One of the things you can try in the evening or even throughout the day is using a humidifier. So especially if you're a mouth breather at night, having a humidifier nearby might help with the dry mouth to some extent. So those are some of the top suggestions that I might have.
And
There's
Randy,
also
I
some things
was
you
just
can avoid as well.
Okay, and Randy, rather than getting into this too much right now, I think we ask that you tune into the meeting and contact one of the sponsor organizations that could probably give you a lot of information immediately. But on the day of the meeting, you will hear from many people that are trying all different kinds of things, and it's part of the purpose of the meeting. The people with xerostomia will be learning from each other as well.
Yeah, and this is James, just to add to that, and it may have been someone living with xerostomia who asked that question even. We want to just encourage that when we ask you during the meeting to chime in and share what it is that you're currently doing to try to help manage or live with your xerostomia, we want to, whether it's something that you just heard as some of the common techniques, or even if there's something else that you do that's different from that, we really want to encourage you to, chime in as part of the discussion, share those things, talk about how well they work, if they do work, as well as what there may be, what things don't work as well or aren't providing you as much relief as you might want. And so, we really want to, part of this is to help understand what exactly everyone is doing and using. Encourage you to participate in the meeting and share, any strategies that you might use.
Yep, and I'll just point that out. Actually, people have been sort of chatting a little bit of things that have given them some success in that regard. So I'll point people to look at the chat for that as that goes on. Another question, probably for Elizabeth again. Are there, maybe you may have already answered this. Are there any drugs or protocols that are available now or in the past to reduce or prevent effects due to treatment of cancer?
Yes, that's a good question. I don't know offhand of preventative drugs that are available to help prevent xerostomia from occurring. There may be somebody who can help answer that. I just don't have the answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is James again. Some of these questions will be, our team is focused on planning this meeting, so we don't have all, the answers about treatments for xerostomia. But, again, this is something that it's a great question because it helps highlight something that's important for this meeting, which is, not only do you want to know what you're using now, but we're going to ask what your treatment goals and priorities are. And that can include things that you wish you had had in the past. So even if it's, you now have xerostomia as a result of a cancer treatment. If you talk about, if the prevention of xerostomia, or maybe even, if it could fully be prevented, if perhaps it could have been prevented so it was more mild for you, that's the kind of thing that would be very useful to bring up as part of our discussion at the meeting.
Okay. One other question that was sort of in line with that sort of line of thinking. Do you consider the negative impact of xerostomia, such as tooth decay, a valid line of reporting to the FDA?
Yes, this is great, and the answer is yes. And I think there was another related question about, xerostomia is itself a symptom. So kind of what do you mean by other symptoms or health effects? And so that this is, probably a perfect example of, there's downstream impacts that your xerostomia may have, whether that's on swallowing and nutrition, or, tooth decay, maybe your ability to sleep. Talking about, something I didn't know about, but with that comment about humidifiers, that's an important, symptom that might, for some of you, might be impacted, lip health, things like that. So, think of it not just as, the direct symptom of, that is xerostomia, but also those other complications that are a result of it.
Great.
Yeah.
And I think several questions have popped up sort of skirting the same question. How do we get a copy of the Voice of the People report? When might that report be ready for us to read?
Sure, I can answer that. So once the meeting is finished, we will try to transcribe the meeting. We will collect, need to transcribe everything that people, from the phone calls that were called in, as well as comments that people wrote in. As I said, there'll be a medical writer, a professional medical writer that's going to put all of this information into the report. It typically takes several months for the report to be completed, because then it has to be reviewed. It has to get, medical review, and we just want to make sure that it's the best report possible. But once it is available, it will be on the websites of a link to the report will be on the websites of all the organizations that were part of the planning committee on the first slide. So yeah, and I hope that, they will do their best to get the word out that the report is available. And then, as we mentioned earlier, the report is available to anyone who wants to see it. It's in the public domain. So.
Okay, in regards to, I think, questions related to the meeting, I haven't seen many others come forward.
Okay.
There are more questions about, specific, things related to their condition. I guess we should encourage people to continue commenting in the chat, because that will am I correct, Larry, that those will be used in the report?
Well, no.
Or
So this webinar was just to help inform people about the meeting. As far as some of the things people are coming up with, the questions that they have about, treatments and stuff, that will all be happening on August 19th when we tune in to the meeting. It's the opportunity for you to hear from the panelists that will be speaking, and then from all the people calling in. And we hope that you will call in with, if you've got a symptom that's not being treated, that there's nothing to treat it, please call in during panel 2 and let us hear about that. Like somebody mentioned, tooth decay and dental caries as being a huge problem. That would be more of a topic for panel 1 when we're talking about the symptoms and the impacts. So we're not going to only want to hear about that you've got, dental issues, but we want to hear, how do those dental issues impact your life? What is it doing is it changing the way that you eat? Does it mean that you have to take more time off of work because of dental appointments? We want to really get into the nitty-gritty of learning about what people that have xerostomia, what their lives are like and what they go through.
Yeah, so this is James. I see kind of a pair of questions that's for the host groups. about whether the kind of the chat and this recording will be made available to everyone on the webinar today. But before I let them answer that, I also just want to comment on all of these comments that are coming in, about impacts that you've had. I see someone who's a saxophone player and is talking about the impact of not being able to keep their reed wet so they can play. That's such a might sound like a simple thing, but that can have a huge impact in sharing that kind of experience at this PFDD meeting in August. Or I hear people sharing, this drug, didn't work for me. This one worked, but it had side effects. This other drug worked, but it just doesn't last long. These are the exact kind of inputs that we really want to make sure FDA hears at this PFDD meeting. I see questions about, what about xerostomia from different causes other than I guess that means other than like the cancer treatments. What about from Parkinson medications, for example? And yes, this is, we want to hear from, all of you living with xerostomia at this meeting. But I want hand it back over to and help answer that question about, how you can get access to this meeting recording.
Yeah, well, could we go back to the first slide, please, that lists all of the organizations that are part of the planning for this? So someone asked specifically, is the support for people with oral and head and neck cancer, SPOHNC, can you go to their website? And yes, they are one of the planning committee organizations. So all of these organizations, Head and Neck Cancer Alliance, the National Foundation of Swallowing Disorders, SPOHNC, and then the Head and Neck Cancer Foundation. All these organizations, you can go to any of their websites after that. There will be a link to a recording of this webinar, so anybody can go back to it, or you can send it to a friend so that they could watch this. And then once we have the Voice of the Patient report, they will also all be having links, so how you can access that report.
Yes, there's a question that came in about discussion starters, and how will they be included? And will someone call on us for living with xerostomia and then treatments? So just to recap, so there's going to be a process for identifying individuals to serve as panelists and discussion starters. So I'll ask Larry if he knows, or Erica, or anyone on the team, on if someone's interested in participating in that kind of capacity, if there's an opportunity to still express interest. I know we're pretty far along in planning now, but the important thing is during this meeting, there's most of the discussion is going to be with everybody that's on live. That's what the majority of the meeting will consist of. So if you pre-register for this meeting and attend the actual meeting, we're going to be asking you to call in, as well as to write in with comments. Actually, could be very similar to the chat feature today, but maybe a little bit, we'd ask you to provide a little bit more than what's been provided in the chat feature. And all of that will be shared live. If you call in, I'll actually think of it almost like calling into a radio station or something. You'll call in, you'll get put on hold. And then as soon as I can get to you, I will call on you, and you'll actually get to contribute. The meeting's organized to where the first half of the meeting, we're going to be focused on, the symptoms, health effects, and impacts on daily life of living with xerostomia. And then in the second half of the meeting, we're going to be talking about treatments, both current treatments and what you're looking for from future treatments. And so, we'll ask that you call in or submit those written comments related to the topic that we're on at that time. So if you want to share, you're the person who wrote in about, not being able to play your saxophone, that would be in the first half of the meeting. We're trying to say, what is the impacts on your life of having to live with xerostomia? If you're one of the people who, that you had these comments that you wanted to talk about, the different treatments that you've tried and what's worked, what doesn't work, what has side effects, we'd ask that you call in the second half of the meeting to share those experiences. And probably you have things to share on both topics. So we'd be happy to have you call in multiple times, and hear from you on a couple different issues. So everybody that's on this webinar today can participate in that live meeting and contribute, through the live program.
Yeah, and just to follow up with that, we've already selected the 10 people that will be panelists and the 10 people that will be discussion starters. There will be 5 panelists for topic 1, 5 discussion starters for panel 1, and then there'll be 5 panelists for topic 2 and 5 discussion starters for topic 2. So you will be, if you've been selected already, we will be in touch with you about what the next steps are. If you're a discussion starter, there's no preparation until August 18th to participate in a rehearsal for the meeting. So.
Great. So thank you, Larry, James, for presenting today, and Erica for hosting. Thank you all for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for having us, and we look forward to hearing your voices in August at this very important meeting.
Yep. Thank you so much.